to our CNQS Personal Psychology colloquium. We're very pleased and privileged to have Dr. Talino Bruno, who is a graduate of our program. I would like to ask Catherine to do a short introduction about Dr. Bruno's background. So I would like to extend you my welcome, and we have food, lots of room here, and we have handouts, etc. So, just come and Catherine.
Hi. So welcome. This is another colloquium part of our community connection series, and I just wanted to welcome you and thank you for coming to attend this informative talk. Dr. Bruno is a graduate of our Human Development and Learning and Culture program, and he did his Ph.D. work on cognitive distortions with adolescents. So that can connect, as you can see, to the topic of today. So he works with the Fraser Health Authority as a youth addictions counselor. He brings a wealth of experience and education to be able to support us in our learning process as we bridge over into the real world. So welcome, and if you have time at the end, we would appreciate, and this is optional, if you could sign our sign-in sheet, which is right here. It's just an attendance list, and it's just supporting our UBC alumni process. Should I pass around? Okay, pass around then. So thank you, and
thanks. Thanks for coming. Last time I did a presentation here was my doctoral defense, so if I start crying, I don't know why.
Feeling nervous?
just a little bit. But the other thing I was going to say is I'm not limited to an hour. I'm in no rush to go back to work, so if we go extra, I'm cool with that if you guys want to ask questions, because I find that a lot of these presentations, it's the questions where you tend to learn a lot more, because I may touch on something but not touch on enough, or you may be interested in something I haven't touched on. Having said that, when I was asked to do this, I'm always kind of wary about what do I talk about, especially to a university crowd and a graduate level crowd, about what level. But from my experience, no matter the amount of education, there's a lot of misinformation about drugs. Okay, unless you work in the field, there's a lot of things that we have these preconceived notions, ideas that there's only one form of treatment. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about. Get that and you can laugh while you're looking at it. We'll talk a little bit, really basically, about different areas of drugs, the type of drugs, their long-term effects, and touch a little bit on how we look at the model that we look for therapy. We're not going to be touching too much on therapy because each one of these standalone sections is an hour presentation in and of itself. So I'll be touching on them. When we, for those of you that are old enough, you may remember this during Reagan's years, the egg and the, okay. We're not talking politics this time. That's a 3-hour conversation about drugs. So, brief overview. We're going to look at some of the problematic use. What is problematic use? And I use problematic use because there's so many different words that people use. There's addiction, there's dependence, and I'll clarify the difference between the two. Some of the risk factors, the continuum of substance use. Where do people lie in a continuum? Because there's people that don't use it all, and then there's addicts and in between. And where is that kind of that slippery slope? I would argue that the slippery slope can occur at any time. Okay, drugs and their effects. That's the kind of the bulk. But I don't want to. I'll have pictures of drugs, and I'll tell you a little bit of the slang terms and things like that. But I don't want to kind of just go over every symptom. I'll just kind of tell you more or less the basic repercussions of the drug use. And it's also in your handouts if you want a more concise list. And then dealing with addiction. What do you do when somebody's addicted? What is the continuum of care in the Fraser Health Authority, where I work, and in the Coastal Health Authority too. So, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. If I know I'm going to answer it later, I'll let you know. If not, I'll do it. So, like I said, you're more than welcome to stay because there's about 190 slides. I'm exaggerating, but a lot of slides, and I don't want to rush through it. But also, I'm aware of your time. So, like I said, I'm more than willing to stay as long as you want afterwards. I don't have any kind of time limit. Okay, any questions so far? Good. So, what's a drug? Seems like a simple question, doesn't it? What's a drug?
Something that modifies reactions.
Yeah, yeah, very good, yes. Anything else?
Sorry, I couldn't hear what you said.
Oh, something that modifies your natural state of being. Very eloquent definition.
Well, I think it's a chemical.
Can be, yeah.
Oh, maybe not. Well, I'm interested.
So, basically, any substance other than food which changes the way the body or mind functions. Okay? So, now some people will argue, what I was saying there is, some people will argue that shopping is a drug, which is not a chemical. Or gambling.
Love is a drug.
Love is a drug, Roxy Music will say. Yeah, exactly. You know, and those are more kind of like, well, that's more kind of the colloquial use of drug. It's more, that's more of an addiction. Okay? Now, it may or may not have medicinal properties or purposes. Heroin has medicinal purposes, but is also used illegally. It can come either from a plant, or a lab, or a little bit of A, a little bit of B. Once again, let's look at our friend heroin. It comes from morphine. You know, people assume that heroin comes from poppy. It's not heroin that comes from poppy, it's morphine that comes from poppy. Morphine then is distilled or synthesized into heroin. Okay. And as an aside, by the way, I'm going to be throwing a little drug trivia here for you anyways. The first people to market heroin were, it's a very famous drug company.
Pfizer.
Bayer. Yeah, Bayer. Because it's a narcotic analgesic, but they thought it was less addictive than morphine. Wrong. So, it could be legal, illegal, helpful, or harmful. The legal, illegal is more cultural and societal. Okay? Helpful or harmful is a matter of subjective opinion. And we'll touch a little bit more on that. So, substance use, appropriate use, and I use appropriate use quote unquote, because appropriate use depends on your context and who you're dealing with. If you're hanging out with the kids in an alley and smoking weed, that's appropriate use of weed. If you're the parents of these kids, that's inappropriate. Okay, so you've got to look at the context. Okay? So, appropriate use, typically to treat illness. That's what we, when we think of drugs, and somebody will say drugs, well, typically you think illegally, but when you think of pharmaceuticals and prescription drugs, you think of treating illness. To reduce pain, to prevent illness, inoculation. Manage mental illness, antidepressants, anti-anxiety, antipsychotics. Helping body do things that it can't do on its own. Most common example would be insulin. And appropriate use, as I was mentioned, is influenced by factors such as religion and culture. Okay? Some religions and some cultures frown upon any drinking, whereas other cultures, that's part of growing up. I grew up in an Italian household, and one of my earliest memories was when my dad used to make wine the old school way with the press. He'd give me a little cup, and I'd put the little cup underneath the grape juice coming down, and it was fizzy because it was fermenting. I liked it. Didn't become an alcoholic, mind you, but I liked it. That was normal. That was a normal cultural event. And if you look at the levels of alcoholism between countries, let's say Southern Europe, Portugal, Spain, Greece, Italy, and countries that are more, I guess, more prescriptive about alcohol use, such as England, Germany, the alcohol rates are far higher in Northern Europe than they are in Southern Europe. So there's that cultural point. Now, there's substance abuse and misuse. Never been a fan of the word misuse, but it does, in certain situations, it does kind of describe what is going on. So, the way I kind of look at it, and I'll touch on this, is that any use of drug that causes problems in either your health, work, relationships, legal, financial, or emotional problems, and some say even spiritual, is being misused. It's problematic use. Okay? That's not a DSM-4 definition, but that is more of a practical definition. So the way that people tend to abuse or misuse drugs is taking too much, or which is typically like binge drinking. So like instead of, a glass of wine, red wine is typically meant to be healthy. 12 glasses of wine, not so much. Okay? I have my uncle who's like 65, and he glommed onto this in the news. He goes, glass of wine is healthy for you, so 12 must make me 12 times healthier. No, didn't stop him, mind you. Or smaller doses more often, combination of. Too long, drug is no longer needed and you tend to take it longer. This is typically prescription medication, and what drug do you think is the most commonly taken far too long?
Valium?
Valium? Yep. Nowadays?
Tylenol 3.
Close, that's codeine, yeah. Yeah, Percocets and Oxycontin, painkillers. People will take painkillers for pain, but then they think, oh wow, you know what? I'm not as stressed as much as I was, and the pain's gone, but I'm going to still continue using that. Then there's the wrong use, different illness or complaints, or using somebody else's prescription medications. I know some kids swear that they get high by taking antidepressants. They don't, but they swear they do. A lot of the kids that have ADHD will sell their Ritalin, and Ritalin is speed. That's basically all it is. It's a form of methamphetamine. It works if you have ADHD. They don't know how. The theory is that it helps you focus because it sharpens the brain if you have ADHD. If you don't, it actually gives you a high. So people will use other people's medications, go into their mom's pill box and take whatever. I mean, I've heard kids taking birth control pills thinking it's going to get them high. Okay, so then there's the most dangerous is the wrong combination. Okay. And combinations can produce unwanted and typically dangerous effects. The one thing that you're going to hear me say a lot about this, and if anybody says otherwise, they're wrong. Anybody says will or does when it comes to drug use and humans, wrong. May, might. Okay? Just remember that from any kind of statistical course. There is no A-B cause and effect. Okay? And anybody that tells you that, wrong, okay? Because you all know we're dealing with humans here, we're dealing with drugs, we're even dealing with basic physiology. People metabolize drugs differently. People's reactions to drugs are different, so it's not one size fits all when it comes to addiction. But, having said that, I'm going to break my rule for 30 seconds and just give you a little bit of hyperbolic expression that I like to tell anybody. Alcohol plus any drug equals death. Okay? Now, you're smart enough to know that that's not always the case, but it's a general rule. You never mix alcohol with any drug. It tends to cause the most damage. Okay? And the other thing is never mix like and like. So you never mix a depressant with a depressant. That's usually a recipe for suicide. Okay? Stimulant and stimulant, you can, but it's also might be a recipe for a stroke or a heart attack. Because what these drugs do is they potentiate, which means they add on top of each other. What typically does happen with a lot of addicts, or even non-addicts, is that they will use one drug to counteract the effects of another drug. So a common use of drug socially may be cocaine and alcohol. Alcohol's a depressant, cocaine's a stimulant. What it does is it kind of evens you out. But the neat thing about this is that those two drugs actually form a third drug in your system. It's called coca-acetylene. It's a different type of drug that actually causes a different type of high, and it puts you at higher risk factor. Okay? So, the take-home message from that is you do not have to be an addict, alcoholic, diagnosed to have a problem with drugs. Okay? And that's an important distinction, because people think it's like I have to have all these things to be an addict. Now, if you go through the DSM-4 TR, yes you do. But in a practical aspect, no. So, how do we define problematic use? Well, this is verbatim from the DSM-4. I'm not going to go through it. But suffice it to say that you have to have 3 or more of the following occurring at any time in a 12-month period. Okay? The one I want to, and like I said, you all have a DSM-4, I'm sure, so you can look it up. You don't have to read it. The 2 things I want to really talk about that are really important and that people have heard about but not sure what it means is tolerance and withdrawal. Okay? So, can anybody tell me what tolerance is? You've all heard the word, right? Yeah. What's,
Just as an anecdote, I met a former NBA All-Star who told me that he was taking, at the end of his career, up to 260 Percocets a day.
that's tolerance. That's also a major addiction. That's also money. Okay? There's another aspect of addiction, that if you have enough money, you don't look like an addict. Okay? We have a lot of our notions of what addicts look like by looking downtown east side. That's not your typical addict. That's an addict with mental health issues. Lots of mental health issues and societal issues. But if you're rich enough and you can afford the good stuff, it doesn't affect you I mean, it'll affect you, but it's not as noticeable. Okay? So yeah, tolerance is basically taking your body needing more and more of a drug to be able to get the same high that you did before. Okay? Now, there's brain chemicals, and I didn't even go into that's the neurotransmitters and things like that. But basically the brain and the body and anything in nature likes balance, and the fancy term for that is homeostasis. Okay? When you introduce a drug into a body, the brain's neurotransmitters, typically dopamine, depending on what drug, will shut down because they're getting enough of it from the cocaine or what other drug you're doing. So, when those shut down, as long as you continue giving the body cocaine, it'll be okay. But, at a certain point, given a week or two, depending on how much, what the dosage is, it balances out, the person doesn't get the high anymore. Okay? So they're going to need more. And once again, there's that kind of a balancing act until you get to a point where it no longer, you're not going to never get the high again. So do people understand tolerance then? So now that brings us to withdrawal. Up until a certain point, people are taking drugs to get a high, to get euphoria, to get the feeling of the drug, to get what they want out of the drugs. It's diminishing returns. Once you get to a certain point, the object is to avoid withdrawal. And withdrawal is what happens to your body. It's a physical reaction to the drug. When you remove that drug and the brain says, whoa, what's going on? I no longer have cocaine, let's say, but I no longer have dopamine. Because the cocaine has plugged those receptors. The body's not producing dopamine because it never needed to. All of a sudden, flush of dopamine or flush of serotonin, and you get weird mood swings. Part of withdrawal. Who's had the flu here? Okay, there you go. Everybody's had the flu. Withdrawal is something like maybe about 100 times worse. Okay? So, depending on what drug you're taking, the withdrawal is typically the opposite of the drug. So, people on stimulants, you think they're all stimulated and obviously with the high. Their withdrawal, one of the hallmarks of withdrawal from cocaine and any stimulant is sleeping all the time. Whereas withdrawal from a depressant such as heroin is unable to sleep. Okay? There's a little bit of argument about whether each drug has a specific form, a kind of idiosyncratic withdrawal. The two that we know for sure have idiosyncratic withdrawal are alcohol withdrawal and heroin withdrawal. Heroin withdrawal is aches, very achy bones they call it, your bones ache. Inability to sleep, drug dreams, sweating, chattering, diarrhea, constipation, you name it, it makes a runny nose. And it usually typically lasts for about a week, and the third day is usually the peak, and then it starts kind of with diminishing. Okay? Alcohol withdrawal, if severe enough, can cause DTs, which is delirious tremens, which is almost a psychotic reaction. Okay? Well, let me ask you this. What is the only withdrawal that can kill you? Alcohol. Alcohol is the only withdrawal that will kill you. Every other withdrawal may feel like you're going to die, but you won't. But alcohol withdrawal can actually kill you. So when anybody comes in and says they want to, like in my office, they want to withdraw from alcohol, I usually suggest they either go to a detox center or do it through a doctor and slowly titrate themselves off the drug. Because alcohol can cause seizures. Coming off will cause seizures. Okay? So, I'm guilty of this as anybody else, interchanging the word dependence and addiction. I typically use addiction as the kind of just the catch-all word, but it's different. The DSM-4 does not call addiction, it calls it dependence. Okay, there's no such word as addiction in the DSM-4 TR. Okay, simply because addiction is psychological. Addiction is a compulsion. It's an urge to use. Dependence is a physical phenomenon. And the hallmark of dependence is tolerance and withdrawal. Okay? Now, you can be dependent on a drug without being addicted. So, you need painkillers for your back. You need it to remove the pain, but you're not addicted to it. Okay? You can be addicted without being physically dependent. Certain drugs don't cause a severe withdrawal, typical marijuana or magic mushrooms or things like that. Or you can be physically dependent and addicted, which is what we consider the typical, stereotypical addict. So to kind of make that a little clearer, is if we all had back pain, let's say, and we were all on Oxycontin, okay? We took it for 3 weeks. If we all stopped taking it abruptly, we would all more or less go through withdrawal. We'd all have the withdrawal effects. The difference between that and an addict is that for some reason you had a magic wand, you were able to get rid of your back pain, you'd still be using the Oxycontin. Okay? That's the compulsion to continue using because it's providing something over and beyond the pain killing, the analgesic effect. Does that make sense? Good. So, addictions, the 3 C's. So this is a really good kind of mnemonic of remembering, that's not really a mnemonic, but just remembering what's important about addiction, what it typically means. There's control. You lose control. Repeated attempts at trying to control it, and you think you do, but you don't, and you go back to it. You might be able to stay a day or 2, but you typically go back to it. There's a compulsion. A person experiences a sense that they must use, and that's so hard to define or explain. The best way I've kind of come up with is, you know when you leave your house and you're driving, all of a sudden you think, did I close the door? That thing, that doesn't get out of your head, does it? Until you go back and close the door. Okay? That's a compulsion to go back. The obsession is the thought, but the compulsion is to go back. And then there's consequences. There's continued use despite significant negative consequences. And remember, consequences are subjective. Somebody that's been using drugs, getting arrested is not a consequence. It's part of doing business. Some young kid who gets caught in the alley scared shitless of their parents. That's a big consequence. For others, it doesn't matter. Right? So consequences, people think, oh, well, they've been arrested 4 or 5 times. You think they learn. No. I had a client, a 14-year-old girl. She maybe weighed 90 pounds. Didn't see her for a week. Where were you? I was in the hospital. What happened? Drank a 26er. Had to pump my stomach. So pump your stomach, basically they throw charcoal into your stomach to neutralize the alcohol. Not a very pleasant experience to have that because you induce vomiting, blah, 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 blah. So you'd think that was a kind of learning experience. A month later, back in the same ER. Same diff. Okay? So consequences are not necessarily the end-all, be-all. The other thing is, too, is you've got to remember is that addiction is a disorder of the brain. Drugs literally change your brain. They change the way your neurotransmitters and the way that your brain functions. Okay? So, what I like to use as a general rule is, as I said this earlier, if the drug is causing health, work, relationship, legal, financial, or emotional problems, it may be time to get help. And you don't wait for all of these to get help. Okay? I know that some people, there's the AA philosophy of hitting rock bottom. That for me is the equivalent of a doctor saying, you know what, you have an infection, but let's wait until it gets really bad, then we'll deal with it. Okay? You deal with it when you can. So, by definition, if you have a problem with one of those and you care about that, maybe it's time to get help. Any questions so far? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about risk factors, and there's a lot of them. Okay? As you know, in psychology and in mental.
Actually, I do have a question.
Sure,
And I remember reading something in the Globe and Mail on addiction, and they were referring to the debate of addiction being a choice versus a, just like what you were talking about,
Yeah, that's in a way that's the kind of it's the AA philosophy, the Alcoholics Anonymous philosophy that if by willpower you should be able to get over it. Current research says no. It's not a matter of having willpower. I mean, some people will say it's willpower, but some people have just, we can use resiliency too. It depends on the support. It's hard to kind of quantify why people can quit more than others. But having said that, I will talk about a little bit later on about treatment and fitting the treatment to the person, which makes it a lot easier to deal with an addiction. But yeah, there are some people, once again, the physiology, there are some people that are able to quit like that. I don't know how many smokers are in here and how many people have tried to quit. But typically, trying to quit is an ongoing process. And when it comes to addiction, there's a 90% rate of relapse. And they say you've got to usually quit about 7 times before it kicks in. So yeah, there is that. The idea about willpower and things, that's more kind of a moral argument, and more of a kind of like if you're a strong person, and it's basically more or less been kind of discredited. Does that answer your question? So risk factors. Well, some personal factors. Our friend genetics. Always a genetic component to everything. Anywhere from 40 to 50% of addiction might be genetic, but the problem is that they haven't been able to isolate the actual gene that causes addiction. So, twin studies and what have you. There's biological factors, how people break down alcohol. Certain people can, certain cultures, certain races can break down alcohol or have the enzyme, or don't have the enzyme that breaks down alcohol, making it more problematic for them. Then there's the drug effects themselves. How is that affecting the physiology? There's personal characteristics, so high vulnerability to anxiety, depression, and one of the biggest kind of, let's say, red flags, we'll say, is impulsiveness in youth. The more impulsive, the higher they tend to use drugs. And when you think about it, it makes sense. Impulsiveness is doing something without thinking about it. Okay? Mental illness, comorbidity between drug use and mental illness, anywhere from 40 to 70%. And we're talking anything from the typical anxiety and depression are the big ones. But there's bipolar and schizophrenia. Gender. And it's amazing that we kind of, like I said, we kind of use addiction as a kind of one-size-fits-all. But there's differences between adolescents and adults, and there's quantitative differences between women and men in terms of addiction. Unfortunately, women tend to suffer almost twice as many consequences of addiction than men, physical and emotional. Men get addicted more, but to different drugs. Okay? Women tend to get addicted more to depressants, whereas men get addicted to more the stimulants. It's almost stereotypical, because stimulants make you feel powerful, right? Whereas the depressants kind of numb any kind of pain or anxiety. Early drug use is also a very strong indicator. The earlier you're using drugs, the more likely it is that you're going to be dealing with an addiction as you go on. And this is not just simple, like I tried a drug early. It's also, you got to think that it's also, look at your environment. If you're using drugs when you're 12, what's the home life like? What's going on in terms of any kind of control over your life? If you're using drugs at that age, typically you're hanging out with older kids that aren't going to school. So there's a lot of other factors that are involved instead of just early drug use.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
If impulsiveness is a factor, to what degree because I guess impulsiveness could be considered like a personality trait.
Yeah.
Or, to what degree can one's impulsiveness be modified? Like, is that something that is dealt with, let's say, young kids that are using drugs? Is part of their therapy or rehab?
Can be.
Trying to modify their impulsiveness?
Because typically when you think of an impulsive, you think of ADHD, right? Or FAS, fetal alcohol syndrome kids. Right? That which might be a little bit more difficult to deal with. But yeah, impulsiveness can be dealt with through cognitive behavioral therapy or even medications. It can be. But you'll find that at the end of this, you take care of one. It's like a hydra. You cut one head off, there's a bunch of other heads that might cause something, right? Family of origin. Was your family using? You're coming home and your dad's passed out on the couch, or mom had a crack pipe in her mouth, Abuse. So when you typically think about it, it's like, oh, they were abused. That's not necessarily the case all the time. Culture is also a potential factor. External stressors, so poverty, job stress, single parenting, unemployment, and divorce. And you'll find that single parenting takes a lot of this stuff into effect too, right? It's an amalgam. Exposure to trauma. soldiers coming back from war, or not even having to. Obviously you can talk more about this, but you don't have to have experienced actual warfare in so much as just being close to it or seeing what the results are, right? A lot of this research in terms of trauma and drug use stemmed from the Vietnam War. That's where we get the PTSD and the use of heroin and such. Simply because it was available, you're in the Golden Triangle, but also the age of the kids and what they were witnessing, a lot of them. Okay, and peer group is also a big one. What's your peer group like? Is your peer group into drugs? Peer pressure is not like the after-school specials where some kid is doing this. Hey, you want to smoke weed? No. Oh, you're a loser. Okay, I'll smoke weed. It's a lot more insidious than that. It's like it's your friend smoking weed, having a good time. And you're like, what am I missing out? Because most people will be like, do you want it? No, good. Okay, more for me. Right? They're not going to force you into drinking it or taking it. The other issue is also availability of substances. Like, what's available? Depending where you live, you'll notice a kind of spike in certain drugs. You're not going to get a high rate of cocaine use out in the woods if you're a logger, but alcohol use, right? Vancouver, a lot more common if you want to do crystal meth or cocaine. Alberta, maybe not, because it just costs more money. It's the availability that also influences. And remember, if you need a drug, you will get a drug. Okay? Tell a little anecdote. I worked in a custody center for youth for 4 years, and one of the guards came over and said, "Hey, 3 of the kids are sick." Okay, talk to the doctor. No, we want you to see something. So basically, they showed me a liter plastic bottle of Coke, right? And at the bottom was this just gross, multicolored, moldy crap that these guys had drunk. I was like, what the hell? And then I'm looking at it, he's like, you know what they did? And they're like, no, what? I go, that's homemade hooch. And they're like, how? I go, well, let's look at this. And we kind of pieced it together. And at lunch, kids would get fruit, right? Like the fruit in the little thing. They would save it, throw it into the bottom of the bottle. Sugar ferments. Sugar produces alcohol. Sugar also produces violent vomiting. So, like I said, where there's a will, there's a way. And if you need a drug, you will get a drug, and you will try to kind of smoke. I mean, I remember seeing kids just trying salt or whatever, just because they thought it might get them high. Oh, got this. I love this, by the way. Okay, so continue. Any questions about that? The risk factor. Like I said, there's multiple risk factors. Okay. Sure.
I was just reading recently this thing in National Geographic about the teenage brain, and they're looking at impulsivity in youth, and that it's actually a part of our inheritance is a good thing. That this is something that teenage brains do as an evolutionary thing.
Yeah. It's a development. It's not necessarily a negative thing. It's a developmental. It's part of the development of like a teenage brain. Because when you think about teenagers, you think about one of the stereotypes. They do stupid stuff, right? But they typically are able to kind of get around it. But that's what like one hand giveth, the other hand taketh. So there's a thing impulsive, like I'm going to go snowboarding and I'm going to go off the beaten path. There's another thing, I'm going to try this drug. So at the end of this, you'll find that it's not just one thing. It's a convergence of factors, and impulsivity being one of them that may cause somebody to start using drugs or abuse drugs. Sorry, go on, I interrupted you.
Yeah, so my question is just wondering if in your work in youth addictions, if there's any people looking at like availability of an outlet for impulsivity, so that if I don't have an outlet for impulsivity, I'm going to find an outlet for impulsivity.
Yeah.
If drugs is available, that's what I'm going to choose.
Yeah, there are some community centers do a lot of this, like kind of the sporting, like skateboarding or basketball, or trying to get them just like physically engaged. But there's also related to sensation seeking. And I'm not sure if any of you have heard of this. Sensation seeking is also, it's Zuckerman. His idea was that certain individuals are just basically genetically predisposed to need a little bit more excitement, or a lot more excitement than others. And if they don't get that certain excitement, it doesn't feel good. So if we get excited driving 90 clicks an hour on the highway, they need to go 120. to get the same kind of feeling. But no, but the thing is, specifically targeting impulsivity, it's more of a clinical thing, right? I know that they try to engage kids into groups or athletic events and make it kind of more accommodating to them, but there's not anything specifically for that. That's where, like I said, where I come in and I would kind of say, okay, like I'm talking to somebody, maybe let's deal with this. Because, you can usually tell a kid that's impulsive when they come into the office just by talking to them. So continuing with substance use. Now, substance use, obviously, as in any kind of use of anything, falls on a continuum. It's neither, the two extremes are yes, no, but there's always in between. And think of it as the bell curve, right? Probability curve. Most of it occurs right in the middle of what the typical use is. So, non-users. So basically non-users are people who choose to abstain. They just do not use. And the reasons they may not use are varied. Health reasons, they may not want, body's a temple and all that. Religious, cultural groups. A big one, negative experiences with an addiction. So AA members, people that have abstained. Okay, and they're following a program and they avoid all drugs. Even more common is following the use of a drug they realize, not for me. I don't like it. Okay? Alcohol. See, the funny thing is, with alcohol, typically, no matter if you get a hangover or you puke your guts out, you will go back in a month. Simply because that's what kids do when they party, a lot of kids, right? There's alcohol, that's part of the party. It's a social lubricant. Okay? A more extreme example is if somebody decides that they want to try heroin. And if anybody's ever been on any kind of strong painkillers, multiply that by a bunch, you know what heroin's like. One heroin addict said to me, it's like floating on a bed of daffodils. And if it wasn't for the constipation, it'd be the best drug. Okay? So, heroin though, even when people use, a common side effect is vomiting after you use. That doesn't stop people. Right? So, it really depends on the experiment and what's going to happen. But I find that this typically kind of falls down when it comes to alcohol and more kind of common, even pot, right? But more so alcohol, because it is, even if you're dealing with a group of people that don't do any kind of illegal drugs, alcohol's always there. Alcohol is at your home. It's out, wherever. Experimentation. And to experiment, people ask me, how long is it experimentation? Well, it's typically, 2 or 3 times or so. Maybe even one. Once, typically, it's just kind of like, no, I'm not going to use it. So 2 or 3 times. You need, first of all, there's some necessary conditions for you to want to experiment. Okay? And you more or less have to have these. First of all, the big duh, you have to be willing to try the drug. Okay? And willing to try the drug is driven by your peers, media, curiosity. So friends or acquaintances that use, and a sense of safety about the drug in the setting. That's very important. So that goes to that. If you see your friends using and they're not having any kind of ill effect and adverse effects, they're enjoying themselves, that provides a safe environment for you to try to use. If your friends are there to kind of back you up, if something happens, you're more willing to try. I know, I've heard of 19, 20-year-old kids going to 13-year-old kids and giving them free booze just to see how quickly they can make them puke. That's not trusting environment, okay? That's just fun for the 18 or 19-year-olds, and stupid too, by the way. But so some of the reasons for experimenting, boredom, curiosity, the big one, the peer pressure, lack of stimulating or exciting alternatives, a need to belong, and sometimes, and it's not really kind of something that comes up that you think about, is self-medication. It's almost by accident. If somebody is bored or is not very stimulated about anything, they might be suffering from depression, let's say. And all of a sudden they take a drug and it's like, I feel good about myself. I actually feel motivated to do something. It's like, okay, well, this is a good thing. I'm being reinforced. And like I said, I'm not talking too much about the brain, but the drugs hit the reinforcement center of the brain and hit it strong. And that's where everything comes around. And so we have basic drives, and one of in a nutshell, the basic drive is for pleasure. We enjoy feeling good. Occasional use. This is where you start getting more of the population involved. And this is to celebrate special occasions. The use is infrequent: weddings, Christmas, New Year's. Typically never to intoxication, maybe to tipsiness. You feel a little feel a little glow. But it's not ever really associated with any life problems. Now, having said that, given what our drinking and driving laws are like now, it can. Doesn't make you an alcoholic, but one glass of wine can get you into trouble. Okay? Social use. And this is, I would say, probably the vast majority of people use it in this way. Okay? And it's generally done in social settings, but the important thing is that it's one factor in the event. It's not the end-all, be-all factor of the event. If you talk to any adolescent, when they're going to a party, it's A, to be with their friends, hopefully get wasted, and meet somebody. Mix and match the order. But those are the kind of order. But alcohol is always kind of like at the forefront for typical adolescence. Okay? Now, some of the key concepts of this, it's no important aspects of a person's life are affected by this. Okay? Now, you do get the office party morons, but that's usually just oops. Right? If you didn't get fired or sexual harassment suit, it's typically, it's kind of a one-off deal. The use is not important compared to other activities. So you don't miss your soccer game the next day. You don't miss work. And the reasons for using it is just basically socialized. Because I'll tell you a little secret. Drugs work. Okay? Drugs do what they tell you they're going to do. And even better than you think they're going to do. The problem is the long-term effects. That's when you have to pay it. But just remember, people use drugs because drugs work. And we celebrate important occasions. Even people that don't drink will typically take a sip of champagne on New Year's, right? Even just a little try. Instrumental use. Now, instrumental use is starting to get. Now you're starting to get into that what I call the one foot on the banana peel, the other one in the grave. You're in the slippery slope here because instrumental use is now you're using it for a purpose that's besides just socializing. The alcohol or the drugs are providing something that you don't typically have, okay, or not getting enough of. So it's kind of almost in a way seeking pleasure but avoiding pain, so you get both. Unfortunately, sometimes in the pursuit of seeking pleasure, you get pain, but then you drink again and you forget about the pain. It kind of goes around in circles. So pleasure seeking, fun, power, and control. Exploring new states and perceptions is a common way. The social lubricant, it reduces inhibitions. All of a sudden, you think, you know what? You're Brad Pitt. I can talk to anybody. Never mind you're spitting all over the poor girl's face and drooling and not making any sense, but you think you're really good. Okay, so that's the social lubricant. And if you don't believe me, go to a party where everybody else is drunk and you're sober. It's an eye-opening experience. The other one is avoiding pain. And this could be psychological, physical pain, but typically psychological pain. And it may reduce anger, guilt, shame, grief, boredom, anxiety, or whatever other feelings you have. Now, the dangers of this is that significant problems may begin to arise because you are getting this reinforcing pleasure. You want to continue using it. Okay? So now you start getting into habitual use. Sorry.
Do you know it's the 15-minute mark, so it's 1:30.
Oh, okay. We have 50 more minutes?
Yeah, technically.
We're not even near it.
Or longer if something.
I said, if you guys can stay longer, I can go. So, habitual use, suffice to say, this is when serious problems are happening in one or more areas of your life. Remember I told you about the relationship. You start seeing these problems. Other people start seeing these problems. I've had kids that have come in as my drug dealer says, I have a problem. Okay, when your drug dealer tells you you have a problem, it's time to see somebody. Okay? Now, almost all friends will be users. The ones that aren't either kind of go by the wayside and leave you be, or you let them alone. And all social functions involve using. Compulsive use. Now we talk about like what we consider dependence or addiction. Okay, there's the overwhelming physical and or psychological need to use, and we talked about tolerance and withdrawal. This is when it starts kicking in. Okay. And then what I call university use, binge use. So doing what you have to do for a week, but getting wasted Friday and Saturday, recovering on Sunday, being able to go to school on Monday, and Tuesday, okay? So binge use, in a way, it's not as continuous, but it's sporadic, but it's a lot more doses, a lot higher dosages. So it can be as problematic as regular use. The problem with binge use is that it's often associated with higher levels of problems at work. So not showing up for work, or even school, not getting that, not getting that paper done, not being able to get that paper done. Go downtown on a Saturday night, you'll notice the hostility and aggression. Okay, higher arrest, higher levels of domestic violence, and higher hospital admissions because people aren't sure how much they can take. I remember when I was going here and I was in my undergrad, Gage, they still have Gage towns? That's first year students. There were people falling downstairs, and there was ambulances every Friday and Saturday night because all of a sudden you get these 18 or 19-year-old kids not at home anymore. All of a sudden they can drink as much as they can, but they don't know how much they can handle. And it was causing a lot of issues. So, a formula for addiction. An enabling environment, vulnerable person with all those risk factors we were talking about, access to drugs, can, repeat after me, can, not will, can lead to dependency or addiction, okay? In a way, an addiction is almost like a perfect storm of risk factors coming together. Not one risk factor will cause addiction. Not all risk factors will cause addiction. But having said that, one risk factor can cause addiction, and so it's individual. So, drugs and their effects. Like I said, I'm not going to go, this will just be a little quick, just to give you a little idea of what they look like and what some of the slang terms they use are. So, first of all, routes of consumption. Inhaling, injecting, snorting, and swallowing. Which is the most addictive way of doing it? Who agrees with injecting? Close. Second. Inhaling is the most addictive. Think about if you ever tried to quit smoking. The reason being, it's actually physiological. When you inhale, it goes directly to the brain. When you inject, it has to go through the arterial system. It takes longer to get to the brain. Okay, and this is in order of addictive potential. Okay, swallowing makes sense because it's got to go down the stomach, it's got to be absorbed, and go to the brain. Now, mind you, sometimes this could take a few seconds to a few minutes, 10, 15 minutes, especially with alcohol. So, stimulants. Stimulants, think of it this way. Stimulants are up, depressants are down, hallucinogens are all arounders. Okay? So up, down, all arounders. Stimulants, the most common ones are cocaine, some of the street terms, coke, snow, flake, blow. Nobody uses snow unless it's in the 1970s. Flake, not very common. Blow is the most common term. Coke, too. Drug dealers call it up. Okay? Crack. Crack. Sometimes it'll just be called crack. Crack cocaine, as I joke, if anybody asks you for crack cocaine, it's the cops. Nobody calls it crack cocaine. It's almost redundant, actually. And rock is really common. All crack is cocaine dissolved in water and baking soda. And you get the name because when you heat it up, it crackles and it forms, I'll show you the picture, it forms a kind of a dirty looking little rock. The effects are similar to those cocaine, but amongst drug users, there's a hierarchy. Drug users look down on other drug users. Cocaine users look down on crackheads.
What's more expensive?
Cocaine. Cocaine, anywhere from $60 to $80 a gram. Crack, you can get a $10 rock or a $20 rock, depending on availability. Cocaine is seen as a lot more socially accepted, a lot more high-end than crack. Okay? Methamphetamine, typically known as jib or meth, we're talking crystal meth here now. That's cocaine. Now that's a lot of cocaine. Okay? That looks like about 4 or 5, now that's almost like $300, $400 worth of cocaine there. Okay? It's not that much, but it's very expensive. That's very clean crack. Typically it's nowhere near that clean. It's spotted with impurities and such. Remember, any drug that an addict will buy, if they're lucky, 30% pure drug. The rest of it is filler. Okay? Cocaine thrown in like baking soda or whatever. That is a crack pipe. And these are basically pipette tubes that you can get anywhere, because you can get them in tobacco stores. A little Brillo pad, they put the rock there, they light it, inhale. That is crystal meth. Not to scale. Okay, it's very, very small, but it's crystalline. It's a crystalline form, and it looks like that color. It's pretty dirty. Now, crystal meth of all the drugs is probably the dirtiest drug in terms of the impurities that are in it. As I said, when I was working in the custody center, a lot of the kids that used to make the crystal meth for the Hells Angels and the gangs would be in there. I wouldn't trust these guys to make me toast, much less my drugs. So quality control is all over the place when it comes to this sort of drug use. That's very, very clean meth. It's never that clean. Now, the other thing is you also got to remember is a lot of the drugs, they add things to make it look cleaner. Like cocaine, like heroin itself is brown, but they add a lot of white stuff to make it look more sellable. That is a crystal meth pipe. And it's basically a test tube that's blown, like Murano glass from Venice. You just go, blow, and it forms a hole, and you plug a little hole in there. Now, I want you to use your imagination. I used to draw this for people. And so you can imagine, long, tall thing,
Right.
people would, yeah. So I had to actually get the picture. And the other thing is too, is that the problem is that I always kind of, and I won't be talking about this today, but this sometimes can trigger addicts. So whenever I have a group from the public, I always say, look, I have pictures. If it's going to trigger you, turn away. But having said that, if I've been spending an hour talking about drugs, that's probably going to trigger you too. So, but anyways, same thing, Brillo pad. The meth is in there, light it, smoke. So these are some of the kind of the side effects of the stimulants. Okay. You could read this, I'm not going to go, I'll go through the more important ones. For stimulants, one of the more, two of the more kind of common but dangerous side effects is that there's a study that says that almost the vast majority of any heart attack under the age of 30 is caused by stimulant drugs. Okay? And then there's the chance of psychosis, which is that break from reality. So you can have a psychotic episode, especially with crystal meth. Okay, so there's paranoia, mood disturbances, delusions, and hallucinations. People that are taking meth and that are coming down from it will truly believe that there's a little black shadow following them. They can see a black shadow following them. They'll freak out that there's cops in there. Right? One of the more nasty ones that usually typically comes with crack cocaine is called delusional parasitosis, and it's a really, really very strong belief that there's bugs crawling under your skin, and they will actually pick away at their flesh until they reach. I've seen scars. You can see the bone. They'll pick away because they think there's bugs crawling under their skin. Okay. Depressants. Depressants produce a feeling of calm. They dull physical pain. Okay, and there's two types. There's the opiates, the narcotic analgesics, which are opium, codeine, morphine, heroin. Codeine, morphine, heroin, same thing. Okay, there's only a slight chemical difference, but they're more or less the same thing. Then there's the sedative hypnotics, which are alcohol, barbiturates, anti-anxiety medication, and GHB. Okay, and as you would expect, the use of depressants will lower heart rate, slow reflexes, impair vision, numb emotions. Out of all the depressants, which do you think does the most damage? Alcohol, by far. By all, it dwarfs all other drugs. Right? I was just reading a little article, and they were trying to make it. They were trying to quantify it in terms of, like, let's say out of $1,000, they just used it kind of. I don't know how they did it. If in terms of damage to monetary, physical, legal. Street drugs maybe cause about $200, whereas alcohol $998.
But is that due to the toxicity of alcohol or just the prevalence of alcohol? Like if we're just comparing
Both.
the drug itself, or is it because of its prevalence in society?
No, the drug itself. The drug actually causes a lot more physical harm, physiological harm, which is the most benign drug.
Pot.
Nope. That doesn't do anything really to your body.
Heroin?
Heroin. Heroin is the most benign drug that you can take, but it's got that, oh my God, heroin. It's the lifestyle that screws you up. But alcohol actually literally it affects your liver, your brain, a lot more of the
It's
system.
crazy that it's...
Well, yeah, that's like I said, that's a 3-hour conversation. Okay? So the problem with alcohol is that at higher doses, you can inhibit vital functions of your autonomic nervous system, which is the part that controls things that you really shouldn't be having to control, i.e. your breathing and your gag reflex. So this is the rock and roll death, swallowing your own vomit. Okay? You take enough alcohol, you inhibit the autonomic nervous system, you no longer have a gag reflex. You pass out, you vomit, goes into your lungs, you literally drown on your vomit. GHB, it's actually becoming really common, and it's kind of like, it's the date rape drug. So it's kind of like roofies, and it was originally a sleep aid, and people put it in other people's drinks to kind of make them pass out. And it's colorless, odorless, and people prefer it to alcohol because it doesn't have as bad of side effects as alcohol in terms of the next day. But one of the problems with taking too much of this is you get sleepy, sometimes the vomiting, muscle spasm, loss of consciousness. It's called G-holding. You just kind of basically passed out there. And the danger is when you mix it with alcohol and two depressants, it's extremely dangerous. Respiratory failure. That's what G looks like. It can be liquid form, powder form. Heroin. Typical down is what it's usually called, or heroin. Nobody calls it horse. It's derived from morphine. And some of the long-term effects are increased chance of getting HIV or AIDS if you're sharing needles. Skin infection is very common. Collapsed veins. Collapsed veins are not like what you see in the movies. It's not like these big black track marks all over you. It's more like little scratches. Little scratches on your legs. And it's basically what, think of this as if you have an inner tube and you keep on plugging the inner tube, it no longer inflates. Same with the drug. Now, remember I was talking about withdrawal. It gets to a point where people are taking the drug to avoid withdrawal. Well, what typically happens is that because if you're injecting, let's say heroin, it can be smoked, injected, or snorted. If you're injecting heroin and all of a sudden you start feeling that feeling of withdrawal and you're looking for veins, a lot of times, I can find a vein pretty quickly. You take it enough, you're going to have trouble finding a vein. So as you're trying to look for a vein, you're starting to go withdrawal. And what typically people will do, they'll muscle it, or they call it subcutaneously, they'll just stick it into their muscle, which tends to increase your chances of infection, and you get abscesses, right? The other thing about the use of drugs is also, because the body is trying to more or less deal with the drug use, your immune system is severely compromised. Aside from the fact you're not getting any sleep, and or you're not eating properly. So you're more likely to get infections, and you'll see people picking at their skin and scar tissue because of that. Okay, heroin is the most common drug to overdose on, simply because of the tolerance. You don't know what you're getting. Even a difference between a 30% and 35% pure can cause a hangover, overdose in somebody if you're not used to the drug. And you hear about it in the news that there's a spate of deaths in downtown East Side because new drugs are coming in. People are used to a certain amount of drug, a certain amount of purity of their drug, and they don't get it. And that can cause overdose. Now there's what typically with overdose, if you catch somebody quick enough, it's called Narcan, which is an adrenaline, the opposite of a depressant. Stick it into your chest or inject it, and you'll just like pop up. And they'll ask you, do you want to go to the hospital? Some people will say no. Problem being is if you have too much heroin in your system, the Narcan wears off, the heroin stays there, you overdose again. That's heroin. That's the typical color, right? And there's different colors. There's little wee balloons, little flap. These things are a work of art, like origami. Some kids in jail taught me how to make them. They're like this small, but they're like envelopes, little flaps. Like, I'm always impressed. So the differences, this basically they may have added baking sugar or whatever, just to make it a little bit more white. One of the drugs that I'm noticing a lot more use of and a lot more dependence on is OxyContins. And so Percocet and OxyContin are used to relieve pain. Very, very good painkillers, and actually relatively new. They only came out on the market in 1996, but they're very, very effective. It contains oxycodone, which is similar to morphine coated in heroin. And it's in both Percocet and Oxycet. Now, Percocet is a slower lasting, lasts about 5 hours. Okay? OxyContin lasts about 12 hours. Now, the problem with the OxyContin lasting 12 hours is that obviously it's a time-release capsule. Well, what happens when you grind a time-release capsule? You're getting 12 hours worth of drugs all at once as opposed to... So, increased chances of overdose when that occurs. And as in any kind of depressant, it's a respiratory depression. So you stop breathing, more or less. So as I was saying, the risk of death can occur when it's broken, chewed, or crushed. That's what it looks like. These on the street go for $1 a milligram. So even the smallest amount is going to cost you $10. Okay, up to 160 bucks. And people use 80 to 100, whatever. There's all different types of dosages. Hallucinogens, typically what we think about is acid, LSD, visual, auditory, or kinesthetic hallucinations. They can be very frightening. And out of all the drugs, these are very much context dependent. If you're in a stressful environment, if you're in an environment where you're not sure of, you're more likely to have a bad trip. Whereas if you're in a kind of a loving hippie set, you're okay. And I don't know if any of you ever watched the Woodstock concert footage. One of the guys goes on stage and says, please don't take the brown acid, because it was bad acid. Okay, so you can get bad batches. And once again, the long-term effects of this, you can have flashbacks and may cause psychosis, especially if you are prone to bipolar or schizophrenia. Okay, then ecstasy, the effects are similar to amphetamine and hallucinogens, but it's typically considered an hallucinogen. Okay, the biggest risk factor with ecstasy is your brain literally overheating. Okay, it actually overheats your brain. That's why they sell water at raves and in parties, and you have to keep on drinking, grinding teeth, but you keep on drinking water, and you never mix it with alcohol, because alcohol dehydrates you. Okay? Research on humans is actually limited in terms of the long-term effects, so we really don't know. But there is some evidence that that damages the cells and the chemistry of the brain, especially with learning and memory. Okay? I mean, in the past 20 years, we've kind of gone a long way in terms of what drugs do, just simply because of MRIs. We can see what the brain function is. And what is interesting too is that a lot of these drugs, they've shown kind of before and after that brain activity after 2 years actually starts to get back to normal if you abstain from the drug for 2 years, typically. That's an acid blocker. So each one of these, I don't know if you can see, is a little stamp, and it's infused with acid, LSD, and you just put it on your tongue and it dissolves. Now, what people will do is we'll hold this will go right into your skin, and it'll cause you to get high too. And it comes with all these whimsical characters, everything from Bart Simpson to biblical quotes. And they've got a bunch of different names for it. Okay? That's ecstasy. That's an ecstasy tablet. And once again, it comes with different names. There's a VW there. And the most common hallucinogenic, obviously, is pot. Okay? And that's what it looks like. This is not very good, by the way. It's too much of this stuff. As kids always tell me, that's crap stuff. It's usually the green part, not the stems you're smoking. Those are how you smoke the joints and the pipe. You just put it in there and you smoke it. All of this stuff is legal. You can get it in any tobacco shop because there's a sign that says you can use for tobacco only. Now, marijuana. There's a lot of issues with marijuana and not legalizing. But the one thing I want to kind of talk about that is definitely contraindicated is for people that are susceptible to either schizophrenia or bipolar. Okay, it can bring the onset of these mental illnesses on if you use it too much. It doesn't cause it. You have to be susceptible to it. But it can definitely increase your chances of starting to suffer from it. Okay? So you have to be vulnerable to it. But we're not clear whether it's the marijuana causes the mental problems, exacerbates them, or is used to self-medicate. There's a lot of people, a lot of kids, let's say with ADHD, tend to use marijuana to try to calm down, try to help them focus. So, the other issue with marijuana is with cancer. There's no real strong link yet, but we don't know. But my rule of thumb is if you're going to put stuff in your lungs, and part of the whole thing is to keep it in your lungs for a good 20 seconds or 30 seconds, probably not very good for your lungs. Okay? Just a general rule. I don't know scientific evidence of that. So, towards the end here, dealing with addiction. how do you deal with it? And like I said, this is going to be kind of a shortened version. There's so many different ways, and not one size fits all. Typically, what you'll get from like family doctors, you're an addict, go to AA, go to NA. That doesn't fit with everybody. Okay? So there's a model that we use in British Columbia. First of all, how's everybody doing? You okay here? You good? Okay, excellent. There's a model that's used in British Columbia for any kind of treatment centers or to kind of guide us. And it's the Prochaska Di Clementi Stages of Change model. This was originally developed for smoking cessation. Okay? Because they were wondering is like, why is it that some people can quit smoking so quickly, others just can't quit? And what they found is that the treatments weren't fitting where the people were at. Okay? So, as all psychologists like, triangles and circles all comes together in one beautiful package here. Okay? So typically you enter in the pre-contemplative. This is where you aren't sure you have an addiction. Yeah, you actually probably say, no, I don't have an addiction. But people around you may see something's amiss. So you come in there and you're thinking, nah, you guys are exaggerating. Okay? But you come in here. So through a little bit more talking, and the next slide I'll kind of tell you what your kind of goals are as therapists to kind of what you're looking for. Then there's contemplation. This is where you start thinking about it. Okay? This is where you kind of like, oh, yeah, you know what, I did fail that exam. Or, you know what, I didn't go to work because I was hungover like 4 times this month. The light bulb starts to slowly flicker. Okay? This is the, yeah, you're right, this is the yeah, but. Okay? And anybody says yeah, but, that just means no. Okay? Because if somebody agrees with you, then they say but. Well, they're not agreeing with you. Okay? So this is the yeah, but here's my excuse. So you got contemplation. You got them at a point where you say, yeah, you know what? I may have something. What are we going to do about it? Then you get into determination. Okay, Talino, I need to do something about this. This is screwing up my life. My wife wants to talk me or whatever. Then you go into action. You decide what are you going to do about it. Once you do what you're going to do about it, you go into maintenance, and you maintain. And maintenance means you maintain that what you desire, what your action was. Now, action does not necessarily mean abstinence. Okay, I get that's the problem with abstinence. When you're dealing with 16-year-old kids, they cannot envision never drinking for the rest of their life, or they don't want to. And there's no point in me saying you can't drink for the rest of your life. That's not going to work. So you work where the person's at. You work at what they want to do. So the first thing I always ask new clients, adults and youth, do you want to quit? The first thing they'll say is, yeah. I go, no, do you want to quit? Not, does everybody else want you to quit? Do you want to quit? Well, no, I'd like to. Okay, how do you see this? How do you see your use? Well, I'd like to drink socially. Okay, let's work with that. But I always say that there are some people that cannot go from abuse to social use. That one drink will lead to 25 drinks. So we have to try to figure that out. Now, depending on where they're at, sometimes you can do a little bit of the harm reduction and say, okay, you know, like you want to cut 50%, okay, we'll cut 50%. Or you only want to drink at, Fridays. You know, I'll kind of actually get a whole, I'll get them to record their use throughout the month. And the first thing I do is actually I kind of tally up how much they actually spent. That's always an eye-opening experience. It's like, how much do you pay for a joint? Oh, $5. Okay, how many joints did you have? It's like, holy smokes. And I go, you don't work. So where are you getting this cash? So there's that part, but it's also like, okay, you know what? Let's try working on this. You're smoking, let's say, 10 joints a week. When is the best day you think you could actually cut down? And we can kind of work. It's like, well, I work on Tuesdays and I'm really tired, but I'm going off. Okay, let's do this. You do it in short, incremental portions, which kind of shows them they can actually do it. Right? It shows them that they can actually have success. There's no point in saying somebody wants to go to 50% and just cutting 50% of their use, because they're either going to go through withdrawal, but B, they're going to fail. I mean, there's a reason why New Year's resolutions, like 85% of them, are broken by the end of January. Because people, I want to lose weight. What does that mean? So it's being specific. So the action is determined on the client. Okay? And then you maintain that. Now, part of the thing may be that eventually I want to quit, but not right now. That's cool. Or you know what, Talino, I'm going to turn 19. I want to celebrate when I turn 19. Okay, we'll stay clean for 5 months. At 19, this is what you can do. Okay? Best case scenario, you exit. Realistic scenario, you don't exit. Okay, you continue doing this kind of rinse and repeat thing. But you rarely ever go into pre-contemplative or contemplation. So there's a difference between a lapse and a relapse. A lapse is just a momentary, like if you're an alcoholic, you drink 1 day or 2 days. And that's it. And you're just like, oh, what did I do? That's okay. A relapse is when I don't see you for about a month. Okay? There's the difference in terms of quality. Now, the important lesson that is you don't let a lapse turn into a relapse. Because some people kind of take that, well, I drank once, I might as well just go a whole hog. Well, no, that doesn't make sense. But it does to them. And a relapse is actually it can be a very important point because it teaches you what happened. Where we typically make a relapse prevention plan where we kind of look at all the triggers, we look at all the things that might cause you to drink. Did we miss something? And if we didn't miss something, maybe you're not that interested in this. Let's move it around. And so you kind of cater that. So the first question I asked after that is, what did you learn? And what made you stop? What stopped this from becoming a relapse? You give a lot of information like that. And then sometimes there's cases where you just don't, things come out of the blue. I had a young lady come in, goes, Talino, I had the biggest urge to use meth again. She'd been clean like for 4 months. It's like, what happened? I was at Metrotown. I go, well, duh. She goes, no, I never used the meth. That wasn't one of my relapses. I was in the underground garage, and I just felt like using it. I go, did you score there? Did you use there? No, I can't figure it out. So it basically turns out that the exhaust smoke from the cars smells like crystal meth. Now, we didn't think about that. We didn't even think about that. But those are the things you kind of learn. So, stages of change. Each area has certain treatment goals. Okay? And these are very general, and you can get a little bit more. But in pre-contemplation, the most important thing is to establish rapport and to build trust. Okay? Get the person to buy into that. You're there to help. You're not going to tell them, don't use drugs, or you're going to lecture them. And raise doubts or concerns. That's tricky without lecturing. But it can be done. Contemplation is normalize ambivalence. It's normal for you not to be wanting to quit this stuff that provides a lot of pleasure or makes you feel good about yourself. Pros and cons. Weigh the pros and cons. What does this give you? What does this not give you? When you're in the preparation, clarify goals and strategies for change. What are you going to do? Make the goals obviously smaller and doable, and offer options for change or treatment. Not every treatment fits everybody. I'm harm reduction, but if somebody wants AA, I have no problem sending them to AA. I mean, for my philosophy is whatever works. But AA is not for everyone, especially if you are bipolar or schizophrenic. It tends to cause a lot more. It tends to kind of mess them up because of the structure. Not even the structure. It's just the kind of top-down approach. Is like you got to do this, and this. Okay, some people don't deal with that. Some people can't deal with that. So you try to fit the treatment with the person. And you try to go, low level, higher level to obviously treatment centers. Actions. This is where you engage the client in treatment, reinforce the importance of remaining in recovery. This is where you start dealing at the underlying issues of the drug use. This is where if it's trauma, if it's abuse, if it's family history, if it's guilt, whatever, this is where you start dealing with it. If you start dealing with it here and here, what do you think happens?
I'm imagining that you're kind of just hammering against the wall, right?
Yeah, well, I think, sure. Trauma, thinking about bad events causes what?
Would activate them.
Yeah, exactly, it causes stress. And the default option for any addict to deal with stress
is
medicating, okay? So you want to get them stable first, then you start dealing with that stuff. Okay? Then there's maintenance. Help identify drug-free sources of pleasure, support lifestyle changes. And these can change. And this sometimes may mean having to dump a girlfriend or a boyfriend or something like that. As I tell all of my clients, you're only as strong as your weakest link when there's two addicts together. And your weakest link may be you or you the next day. So, it's always kind of a problematic in that case. Now, we're almost coming in here, but cognitive behavioral therapy works really well with addictions. Okay? So does DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, works very well too. I mean, everybody's different. I mean, I find that cognitive behavioral therapy works with youth better simply because a lot of them aren't really sure what they're feeling. or how to identify their feelings, but they're really sure about what they're thinking. And aside from that, you can always kind of project. It's like, what do you think somebody else might be thinking about this? You know, like, how do you think somebody else might have dealt with that? It's a little bit easier to kind of activate. Now, one of the addict's core beliefs is that life would be unlivable without the drug. Without the drug, I cannot function. Okay? And up to a certain point, they're right. That's why you kind of slowly work them along. So their thinking is that drug use must continue at all costs. And their belief is maintained by cognitive distortions. I'm worthless, or I've let everybody down, or everybody must love me, and my group of friends loves me because I'm a great drunk. But what this does, it helps insulate from the pain their use causes themselves and others. So it's almost, it's in a way, it's these thoughts activate their core beliefs, and it maintains their use simply because it avoids having them look at what's going on. Now, you get somebody, CBT is one, like I said, is one of the ways that I typically use. And there's different techniques you can use, you know, like pros and cons, or you know, diaries, or any kind of technique really works, but make it obviously fit the person that you want, right? I don't typically, I ask people, and sometimes surprises me, but you know, like guys typically don't like journaling. 16-year-old boys don't typically like journaling, but I ask, do you like writing? No, I hate writing. Well, I'm not going to say, okay, great, I want you to write every day what you're feeling. Okay? That doesn't work. You work where you go where it works for them. Right? Some people like songs, like music. Use music. How does this song describe how you feel? Bring a song, you know, you're a musician. Bring some songs you've written. You're a poet. Bring some poetry, what have you. So our system of care is fairly good, not great, and very limited, obviously, with any system. The biggest problem with our system of care is that it's not long enough, especially when it comes to adults. Plus, there's that 19-year-old dead zone, as I call it, because you're no longer an adolescent. Typically, you can't go into an adolescent treatment center, whereas by government standards, you're considered an adolescent until 24, in terms of treatment. But it's not always advisable to be putting you in with a bunch of adults that are 50 or 60 years old. So it's kind of like that weird kind of gray area. There's nothing specific for them. But just to look here, we have community support groups, tend to be free, so AA, NA. They could be for like people that are dealing with addictions, that are substance affected. There's detox. Detox, and this is what people typically think of as treatment. Detox is not treatment. Detox is simply a place that you can go to, and they help you clean up from the drug. There's doctors there. They typically give you Valium to calm you down, help you sleep, and you're out of there in a week to 10 days. Okay? But that is the dependence part that you've dealt with. You haven't dealt with the addiction part. That's where therapy comes in. Okay? Now you can do detox at home, most people do, or residential. And typically what it is this is self-referred. You phone the detox, you give them your number, you keep on calling every day. And you hope that there's and you have to go like that. Opening now. Now, given that most people don't want to go through excruciating pain, there's always openings. So, education series, learning about addiction, learning from reputable sources. The Province is not a reputable source. Every time I read an expose on drugs, I know on Monday I'm going to get parents freaked out that their kids are addicted to crystal meth. No, that's hay fever. Yeah, but it said in the paper. No, it's not. So, reputable sources, typically universities, American and Canadian universities, European universities, some American government sites, not all American government sites. Be selective. I mean, you guys know how to do research. I mean, I'm kind of speaking to the converted. Recovery houses are actually long-term places where people live in a home with maybe 5 or 6 other recovering addicts, and they have dinner, they have lunch, they sleep, everything. They tend to be 12-step, which technically they're not supposed to be. We don't, to be a licensed program in British Columbia, you aren't allowed to espouse 12-step. You're supposed to be the harm reduction model, but 12-step is used, right? So, I mean, you know, whatever works, I guess. Addiction counseling services, they're direct services, which is what I work for, Bruno Substance Use Services, which means that we are directly government. There's indirect services, which are the services in the communities that are non-profits. Okay, and they provide very good services at different ages. Our services provide from 13 to like 80. So we have youth worker, I'm a youth/adult, I do both. But typically I'll do the youth. We have outreach workers, which by the way came out of because of all that thing in the province about crystal meth. 3 years after the fact, but we got crystal meth workers. So they're outreach workers. And then we have over 65, people that are dealing with people with addictions over 65, which brings its own set of complications, not the least of which is dementia. Right? There's, like I said, outreach counseling, you have high-risk youth, you go out on the streets, homeless. Residential treatment is kind of depending on where you go, but might be the gold standard. The only problem is that it's never long enough. It's only about 3 months up to a month. Typically should be minimum a year. There is a program in Karamias for youth that they can stay there for a year, but it's not, there's no real like certified therapist there per se. It's almost peer guided and people that are adults that have an interest in addiction. So that's not necessarily the best thing. And then there's day programs where you can go, it's called DEWI, with day, evening, weekend youth, or day, evening, weekend, where you go and you go during the day, you do exercise, you do group, and then you come back the next day, and so it goes around your schooling and your work. And then there's day talks, which is kind of a similar situation like that. It's not really a deep talks, but it's a day program for adults. That's it.
Oh.
Sorry I rushed through that, but and like I said, if there is, I mean, you know, this is a kind of standing invitation. If there's anything specific that you guys want in the future of one area, like maybe just specifically dealing with therapy, the kind of things you can do with cognitive behavioral therapy, feel free to call me or whatever, what have you. Any questions?
Yeah, well, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Harm reduction.
Yes.
With drugs like heroin. Some of the clients are actually stay on harm reduction regimes for months or years after they work and they.
Yep.
And
Yep.
what's the argument for not slowly titrating them down to being off the
There, you know what? There is that's actually the goal of harm reduction. Like ultimately, that's the goal of completely. Like so, with a heroin addict, typically if they want to titrate off, they usually either go on methadone, which is a synthetic heroin, which stops people from going into withdrawal but doesn't give them a high, or there's a new form of drug. It's called Suboxone, which was common in the States, which is a lot more effective. It actually gets rid of the urges too.
What's the long length of time? That
they can go from like a month to years and years and years and years, like just functioning on methadone in terms of just.
Well, what would be the motivation for continuing on methadone for years when they're stabilized and work and so on, just completely come off it?
They're typically, you don't get people that are methadone like that are stabilized that well.
Okay.
They're not that stable. There's the issues of like mental health issues involved in that.
So if they're functioning well
Yeah.
on methadone,
Yep.
would they then be classified as having a dependence or an addiction?
Dependence because you could go through withdrawal on.
But they may not show the symptoms of addiction if
Yeah.
it's not interfering with their life.
Exactly. That's They would have a dependence because the withdrawal from methadone is actually worse than the withdrawal from heroin.
Yeah.
And some argue that methadone may be worse than heroin, right? So there's that argument. But typically, the point is that when somebody goes on methadone, it's not meant to go for a long period of time. It's meant to make you avoid withdrawal. And so you slowly, like let's say they'll give you like 50 milligrams to 60 to 40. And for those of you that know methadone, it's just basically go to a drugstore. It's a powdered form. They give it to you in a juice, and you drink it, and it blocks your opioid receptor, so you don't have the cravings for heroin, and you stop having the withdrawal symptoms. After a certain point of time, if you're trustworthy enough, they give you carry-home privileges, which is a year. You can have it at home. You can do it yourself, and then people can function a little bit better. But the problem with methadone is that it does make you very tired and lethargic. So the only real motivation for not doing it is fear on the part of the person that they're going to go back to heroin.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, that makes sense.
Well, we can probably continue our conversation. You also have brought your business cards.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
in case you.
If anybody wants it, yeah, if you have any
continue
questions.
dialogue, you're also
Yeah, you're more than welcome to
contact.
give me a shout.
I want to thank you, Talino, for sharing your very, very rich knowledge, experience, and insight. So again, a round of big hands again. I learned a lot from this relatively short lecture. I realized that we probably need a whole day or weekend workshop to learn much more, but this was really good.
This touches the surface, and like I said, it's good that you get kind of a general idea of what's out there.
I think what I learned is this multidimensional aspect
Yeah.
of this addiction.
Mhm.
We talked about psychological, physical, socio-ecological,
Yep.
economic,
Yeah.
cultural, and probably developmental to some
Oh, sure,
extent.
sure.
Possibly, one of the things that we probably did not have time to talk about or listen to is the spiritual side.
Yes.
Particularly when you work with
Mhm.
individuals who come from the very spiritually,
Mhm.
very rich tradition or background.
Mhm.
That would probably be important.
Yeah, very much so, very much so.
Well,
And you're right. It's like it's targeting the client. I mean, if the problem that they're having is a spiritual problem, you target that. That's your door in. That's your way in, right? So yeah, for sure.
So I realized that we probably need
Oh.
sequel.
Yes.
And we have a small token of appreciation from the Alumni Association.
Oh.
To you.
Thank you very much.
Hang around.
Yeah, like I said, if you guys want to ask me questions now, just go ahead. Like I said, I'm in a rush to go to work.